Today by Scott Thoma, who is on our AP Center sales team, so he's with me here today as well. And good morning to everybody that's attending today. Today we'll be presenting an overview of ICM's AP Center workflow product. And simply put, AP Center is a product suite that can help organizations process their invoices in a much more timely and more accurate fashion. This results in more discounts taken, a reduction in duplicate invoices, leveraging best of terms, reducing late payment penalties, and improving vendor relations. The AP Center suite also offers a self-serve vendor portal option. This allows vendors to do their own research regarding the status of payments associated with in-process invoices. So that further reduces your invoice processing costs. AP Center Workflow integrates with your current ERP system and acts as a front end to your final voucher and payment processing, eliminating exception processing within your ERP system. So today we're going to go through a short slide deck, and then we'll take an opportunity to look at the application itself, a couple of applications associated with the suite. So let's just get started. So today when we talk about invoice processing, we're going to be talking about that in the context of what we consider to be a typical best practice type processing of an invoice. And understanding that organizations, when they do process invoices, there are nuances associated with their internal processes, but this just gives us a framework for discussing AP workflow. So a typical AP workflow, what we find is that there's an invoice capture process up front, possibly some OCR recognition. And typically, once an invoice has been captured through whatever modality, it goes through some type of indexing or QA step, and that's what we call the AP specialist step. So once the invoice has had a chance to go through that step, then validated, then it moves on through some type of approval hierarchy. So that's where we have the department approval here. And that hierarchy, again, depending on the organization, can take many forms, but essentially involves some type of process where, for example, a level 0 approver first sees the invoice, validates it, and then it may be done at that point, or you may have a multi-step approval hierarchy where at that point that invoice needs to then basically go to a second approver, maybe the manager, maybe because of threshold levels that are associated with the level 0 approver. There is nuance wrapped around that. That's configurable in the system to address those needs. Once the invoice has been approved, then it's typical for organizations to maybe want there to be a final finance approval or finance review step so that somebody can put their eyes on it at the end and finally say, yes, this is ready to be essentially exported to the ERP system. And finally, on the back end, we have the ability to pull in payment information after the process is complete. So by the time that the invoice has gone through the entire workflow process, you have a complete picture of the approvals that it went through, the routing, and finally the payment information, your payment reference ID, your payment date, the payment amount, so that when researching that item in the future, you've got a complete picture of the item. So that's the basic best practice workflow that we're going to be kind of centered on today. So up front we have the capture process. Now obviously companies are moving more and more from a paper-based system to an electronic system, and depending on the organization, that's going to vary by degrees. Obviously companies that are still stuck in a completely paper-bound system, your expenses are very high in terms of routing that paperwork around, that paper disappearing basically. And at that point, you're losing all of the advantages that we talked about earlier in terms of capturing discounts, affecting your vendor relations, those types of things, late payment penalties. So for AP Center, basically we have three modalities in terms of capturing the invoices. And we have a dedicated scanning app that integrates directly with AP Center, typically used for higher volume clients who need a dedicated scanner and where all of the invoices are coming into a centralized location. We also have the ability to simply import images, invoice images, and that can be from, for example, if you have a multifunction device in an office that has a scanning ability, invoices can be scanned to a file share, and we can extract those from that file share. And in both those cases, both the scanning options, we try to make things as streamlined as possible for the people doing that work. So, for example, if you have multiple invoices coming in during the day, rather than going to the scanner multiple times and scanning them separately, we offer the ability for you to use separator sheets between those invoices. So we have a barcode sheet, just a blank piece of paper that's got a specialized barcode on it. by putting those barcode sheets in between the invoices. They can be stacked together, scanned at one time, and AP Center, as it picks up those invoices when they come in, it breaks them out into separate invoice work items. So that really streamlines the scanning process. And a third method that we have for bringing in invoices, which is becoming more and more popular as time goes by, is you can create an endpoint email address within your organization and distribute that to your vendors. Vendors can attach their invoice to the email and basically just email it to that address. We have a service that runs in the background that will pick up those emails, will extract that attachment as an invoice, and introduce it into the system as a new invoice work item. So in any event, regardless of the way that items are imported into the system, they all end up in workflow and are ready to be processed. So the next step that we go through with AP Center is there is an OCR, optical character recognition process, that will basically evaluate those invoice images and extract the data that it can find on those images. Now, that's always going to be driven basically by the quality of the original invoice, of course, which unfortunately you're not in charge of. Vendors are going to submit what they submit. But what we've done to make the process more streamlined and intelligent is our OCR process is a learning type process. So rather than requiring a lot of configuration up front for each vendor's invoice, and of course they all have different formats, what the system does is it just learns as it goes. So the first time that an invoice comes in, we'll have no information. The system will have no information about that vendor's invoice and the format that it's in. What the OCR is trying to do is it's trying to locate all of that header level information, including your invoice date, your invoice amount, what vendor is providing the invoice, etc. So what the system does is, as the first few invoices are indexed from that particular vendor, it learns about where the data is on the form. So it has basically a general area. It becomes aware of where the invoice date is, for example, and then it associates that with typical keywords that are in the area of that on that form. So it would be like invoice number, or invoice num, invoice no, whatever is on that particular vendor. So we use both the location as well as keywords around the area to identify that particular vendor and where the key information is located on the invoice itself. That allows us to extract the data off the invoice and make that available for your AP specialist, which is that first step that I talked about, where the AP specialist is going to be verifying the index information and making sure everything's correct before routing the item on through the approval hierarchy. All right, the other thing that the system does from a learning standpoint is it remembers GL coding that's been applied to the invoice previously. So we have historical content for this particular vendor, because in many cases the GL coding that goes on for a particular vendor is the same over and over again. So by capturing that historically, we can pre-populate the index information for the new invoice that comes in with that GL data, allow the AP specialist or possibly the approver to update that GL if needed, but if it's not needed, again, it streamlines that process, reducing your invoice processing costs. All right. So invoice evaluation. Three areas here that we're going to talk about. One is best of terms. And what the system can do for you, if you turn that option on, is we have the ability to compare terms that are offered on the invoice with terms that are part of your vendor master file, with, if it's a PO invoice, with the PO terms, for example, and basically select the best terms so that you capture the best discount available. In addition to that, we do duplicate validation. Now, duplicate validation is nothing new. ERP systems do duplicate validations as well. Unfortunately, most ERP systems are very, very strict in terms of how they evaluate that, and very rigid. And so they will look for basically a dead match on an invoice. Our evaluation for duplicates is more sophisticated for that. We look for a combination of values, be it the invoice number, invoice date, invoice amount, the vendor, and we'll basically look for a combination of values that tell us that there's a high probability that this could be a duplicate. And when we find that, we will present that to the user as the invoice processing is occurring, so that they can actually look at the images for both invoices and make a determination as to whether or not this is in fact a true duplicate or not. And finally, we've got the approval hierarchy assignment. And the approval hierarchy is something that gets configured typically for each customer, because there are different methodologies used by companies. But basically, once the invoice is in the system, it's going to follow a path through an approval hierarchy, as I discussed earlier, and that may include things like thresholds and whatnot, in order to get that through the processing that it needs to and the approvals that it needs to. One of the things AP Center does is we try to always make sure that the right invoice is in front of the right person at the right time. So, typically you'd have sort orders involved with this that would do something like look at the invoice terms, look at the received date. We know what the expected due date then is for the item in order to capture those discounts that we're after, and we would prioritize by that. But we can go beyond that, for example, and indicate that a particular vendor or vendors, your real strategic vendors that are hot vendors, that they are prioritized. So we can tag those vendors as hot vendors, and that makes sure that they also bubble toward the top, so that you keep those vendor relations good with your strategic vendors. In order to reduce the burden on your core AP staff, we do everything that we can through email notifications and escalations to basically encourage your approvers to get your invoices processed in a timely manner. Processing them in a timely manner, again, capturing those discounts, avoiding late payment penalties, this type of thing. So if we can push that responsibility in an automated fashion onto the approvers, that's the goal through the email notifications and escalations. And they work much as you'd expect. There is some configuration involved so that you can select to have emails every time you receive an invoice, or a daily recap, or a weekly recap. It really depends on the approvers, how often they're normally approving invoices and how much they really need to be bothered. But we can set timeouts so that if your normal expectation is that invoices are processed, let's say within a 7-day period, we can set timeouts so that after 5 days they get a reminder, for example, and then or at the same time they escalate, and the item can actually escalate out of that person's queue into their manager's queue, for example, so that if a person goes out on vacation or if a person is just out unexpectedly, whatever, that those invoices continue to move through the system. So, all right, and finally, we talked about some interface points, but once the item has gone all the way through workflow, we can go ahead and pick up that payment information on the back end. So we've got our payment reference information in terms of the ID and date and the amount paid, so we have a complete picture of the invoice, including its image and all of the indexing information that's gone onto it at both the header level as well as the GL level. Optionally, some organizations like to actually scan the checks back in. So we've already gathered the data in terms of the reference ID number on that payment, so when the checks can be scanned back in, go through a very short indexing step where the ID is basically associated with that image, and we can associate then that image with the data itself. So that's an option. All right, so that winds up our slide deck, and the next thing we're going to do is we're just going to go straight in and take a look at the application itself. We're just going to look at some of the higher level features that the application has, just so you kind of have a feel for what the features that the application offers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to log in as AP Clerk. Now, every user within the AP Center product is associated with roles that give them access to the data within the system and features that can be used to process that data. So I'm going to log in as AP Clerk today. And this would be your AP Clerk, your AP Specialist. This is the person that I'm talking about who typically looks at the invoice for the first time, validates the indexing, and makes sure it's ready to be routed through its approval process. So the first screen that comes up is we have a view selection. I've got multiple views here because as AP Clerk, I am doing some processing in different areas. But again, this is configured per person and associated with the roles that they're in. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go into the non-PO invoices. I have 2 of them in there right now, and I'm going to bring that up. And as far as the layout of the screen, processing screen goes, what you'll see is you'll see the indexing information down the left-hand side. That's going to be your typical index information that you always want to capture at a high level, your invoice number, date, amount, who the vendor is, whether or not if there's a PO, if it's a PO invoice, the PO number. And we can see those indexes down the left-hand side. Then on the upper right-hand side, we have the image of the invoice, and again, that may have come in through some different modalities on the front end, but by the time it arrives here, all of these work items pretty much look the same. In the lower right-hand corner, we have the GL information ready to be applied. Organizations differ. Some organizations like to have somebody like an AP specialist apply the GL coding right up front. Other organizations have their approvers do it. Other organizations have a mix where the GL is applied up front, but the approvers have the opportunity to update it, for example. But in this particular case, we've got the system configured for the AP specialist so they can, in fact, update the GL as needed. But we'll start by going down the left-hand side, because I'm going to be talking a little bit at length about this particular presentation. But in fact, this process does go very, very quickly, typically. So as the AP specialist, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going down the indexes on the left-hand side, and what the image is doing right now is we get this little yellow highlight, and what it's doing is the OCR process is indicating where it extracted data from, so that very quickly as I go through these fields, any field that has a field associated with a header level field that I want to extract, I'm going to see that pop up, so that I can quickly verify that that number is in fact correct for the invoice number. So this is key, making sure that the information that's been extracted by the OCR is in fact consistent with the indexing information that's applied and that it's correct. And so we just go through, we make sure that the invoice date is correct, that the amount is correct, we don't have any extra zeros in there, anything like that. And so this takes place very quickly just for the AP specialist to go ahead and validate this. The other index fields on the left-hand side, as we go down further, have more to do with processing, and so we can configure this to allow any options that your ERP system has in terms of special handling, separate check, payment method. Is it a check? Is it ACH? Is it wire? That's where we can populate that on the left-hand side. And then if there are any additional fields that just for your particular organization that you want to capture for the invoice for whatever reason, these index fields on the left-hand side are also configurable, so we can add those as we go. All right, let's talk a little bit about the GL application, because again, we've streamlined this as much as we can. And basically, what's been applied here is that historical information for the last time that this particular vendor has sent in an invoice. And so that's been automatically applied. Hopefully, that's the GL that needs to be there. If not, it can be edited at this point. And in addition to that, if one or more of your vendors, if you have standard GL, multi-line GL configurations that you apply to that vendor, we have a nice feature that is what we call GL favorites. I'll bring up that form real quick and just bring up a little test item here. These are packages that you can predefine, and basically, so we have a two-line GL here that we've put in there, and in this particular case, what we've said, we configured it so that if you look to the left-hand side, we've got 20% and 80%. So what we've said is, we'd like this particular invoice, look at the header level, see what the amount is, and go ahead and split that amount over these GL codes, over these accounting strings. So you have the ability to set those, predefine those, and then apply them as invoices come in. Again, it makes it very fast. Or you could have, and you can have one to as many GL lines as you want, and you could just split them evenly if you wanted to as well. So it has that capability. So I will just bring that over. And so that's what it's done here, okay, for our invoice that was $6,000 and change. It has gone ahead and split those according to the percentages that were set up for this definition. So that's a nice feature. And at the bottom then, we're always doing a sum of the GL to make sure that the sum of the GL lines is consistent with what has come in as an invoice amount at the header level. So those are some of the features. There are many, many features in the system. We don't have time to look at them all today, but we, again, try to make it as easy as possible for your data entry people. So for example, I can go into the department and I can hit an F9 key, and that's going to bring up a description for that particular GL segment, so that if you can't quite remember, was it 941 or 942, okay, these types of aids just help you people do the processing much faster. Okay, The image itself, you've got all the standard features in terms of making it bigger, smaller, so that people can process it. We have the ability to email the image, so if you do need to communicate with someone over this invoice, ask a question, you can go ahead and email it. You can bring it up as a PDF and print it or do whatever you want with it. Hopefully you're not printing it because we like to stay paperless. That's the whole point here. But you've got all those options. And then the data itself that's associated with the item, we have the ability to add notes to the item as it flows through the approval process or through the entire workflow, in fact, so that person to person, they can make notes and kind of communicate with other approvers down the line through the notes. We track all the events associated with the item, the history through workflow for each work item, so we have a complete audit log at the end of when the invoice came in, what users it flowed through, what data was changed or applied to the items, and ultimately what approvals were attached to that item. So we've got a complete picture by the time that it's ready to be exported for your ERP. And again, this is not, AP Center is not your financial system of record. That's not what AP Center is. What AP Center is gives you the ability to shepherd these invoices through from introduction through the approval process, validate them so that we're ready to export those vouchers to your ERP. And by the time they go into your ERP, they should be clean and error-free, reducing the amount of work, handling exceptions within your ERP or record, for example. So that's what AP Center does for you. So we're going to take a look at another application right now that is our remote approval app. AP Center is a suite of products, and this is one of the products in the suite. So what I'm going to do is log in, and this is what we call a remote approval app. It's a very simple, web-based, responsive web app that allows your approvers to approve from their desktop, their laptop, their tablet, their smartphone, whatever their device of choice is. And especially if they travel a lot, it makes it very convenient and very nice, especially when you're, again, trying to maintain those vendor relations, especially with your strategic vendors. So what you're seeing here, again, this is browser-based, is a dashboard area that can be configured that gives you the type of overall information you're looking for, or that you'd like to be able to present to your approvers to give them a feel for kind of what's going on, how many items that they've got pending and whatnot. And it presents an entire list that can be sorted so that depending on what that approver feels is most important, they can sort this and work through their list as needed. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring up an item. It's basically organized the same way as the core AP processing application, with your index information down your left and your image on the right. And so you can imagine that this is on a tablet or on a smartphone, and you just want to get an approval happening for one of your vendors, work through your list while you're traveling, that type of thing. All the approver is going to do is very similar. It's going to take a look at the invoice image. It's going to take a look at the indexing information. Now you can see this indexing information is not updatable here. That's a configuration, whether your organization wants to allow your approvers to update this index information. Sometimes organizations say no, if the vendor number or amount, anything like that needs to be changed, it needs to go back to the AP specialist and have them do it. So you've got separation of concerns and duties from an audit standpoint. But this can be enabled for editing as well if that's your desire. But in any event, you get your invoice image, all your header information, your GL information, again, can be turned on for editing if you want to turn that on for your approvers. And basically, once it's all verified, it's ready to be approved. If your approvers have any questions, we also pull down any information that's in the vendor master file that's available, any notes that have been attached to it. In this particular case, Joe Tech was the first person that was the level 0 approver, and they verified, yep, the scanner that we ordered was delivered. We can see that we do have an approval on it from Joe Tech. Now, Joe Tech's threshold is $500, and this is more than $500. That's why it's with the IT director who we logged on right now, and that's why it's waiting for their approvals. Any attachments, the system supports backup documentation. Okay, so backup documentation can be added to the invoice package as well as it works through workflow. And finally, the events that I talked about are available also. They tell us what information was applied to what field by, what entity. So in the beginning, it was the OCR service that picked it up, and then as we go through it, you'll see information regarding how each user has updated any of the indexing information associated with the work item if it has been updated. So ultimately, it's a very fast process, and obviously on a laptop, or rather on a tablet, type tablet, you'd just be tapping the approve, and off it goes, and it's going to continue to the finance review step from there. So that is our remote approval app. So we saw the slide deck, we've seen the core AP processing application, we've looked at the remote approval app, and those are, those two applications are kind of the core applications, and then along with, of course, the vendor self-serve portal and our admin app. So that's our presentation for today. Adrienne, if there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer those at this time.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We do have a few questions, and I did want to remind the audience that if you do have a question, there's a question mark button right next to your name on the webinar pane. We'd love to announce your question for Kelly to answer. If you click on that question mark button, a dialog box will open up where you can key in your question, and I will announce your question for the audience. Let's see. Is your AP automation deployed on-premise or via the cloud?
The answer is yes. We have two options. We offer a hosted solution that is in the cloud, and we also offer an on-site solution that's licensed. So we have both modalities.
And what ERP systems do you have an integration to?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Let me talk about the 4 primary points of integration that we have with most systems. Those integration points are going to be with your vendor master file, with your chart of accounts for the GL, with your payment information. So once the payment's finally made, the check date and amount and ID, and then the ability to create a voucher file, okay, that can be imported into the ERP. And essentially any mainstream modern ERP system, SAP, Oracle, Sage, QuickBooks, Mass, they all have the ability to provide those interface points in terms of a file or direct integration.
And let's see. I'd like to learn a little bit more about your self-service vendor portal. Could you elaborate? You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, and this is a great way. This is kind of one of the ways to really reduce your invoice processing costs. You've really got 2 options there. Either you're going to be answering phone calls from vendors saying, where is my payment, and then having to do the research. If you're doing the research directly on your ERP, typically you've got per seat licensing going on there, and so you've got the same people that really need to be heads down doing the work instead of doing their work of getting those vouchers out, then they're actually doing research, so it takes them away from that. So the costs can add up. So our vendor portal offers the opportunity for our clients to register vendors on their portal, and what it gives them basically filtered access to are the in-process invoices from that vendor, so that they can see what the current status is and see what the expected payment date is, for example, or see if there's a problem with those invoices for whatever reason. So that really takes the burden, the support burden, off of your internal staff, pushes it back on the vendors, and can just really create a great cost savings.
And we are a VAR for Dynamics GP, and we just signed on with Acumatica. What does the implementation process look like with your resellers?
So typically our engagement includes, we have a professional services group that, depending on the ERP in play, we will go and we will either meet via telephone or go on-site and meet with that end client to discuss their needs in terms of the workflow process itself and what their internal business processes are. to come up with a configuration for the system that can be implemented for that customer. We can also do training with partners that are resellers to put them in the position to be able to do that. And obviously, that's something that takes a little bit of time and relationship and training. But those are basically the two ways that we deploy the application.
And could you review the costs of your application and the options?
So I would say, let me put it this way. What we've worked very hard on is coming up with a pricing matrix that does not penalize organizations. And what I mean by that is our model supports per seat licensing as well as volume licensing, and does that in a way, again, so that if a particular client has a lower volume but many approvers versus another client who has just a few approvers but a higher invoice volume, we try to take that into account so that the pricing is affordable and the ROI is achievable and attractive. So, having said that, because there's a lot of variability there and there are options associated with the system, and we just don't have time to go through all that today, but in general, what we find is that our typical client that's 1,000 invoices a month or more, that their fully amortized cost of processing an invoice usually falls in the $1 to $1.50 range, something like that, on a per invoice processing cost. So that's kind of the simplest way to look at the cost of the system overall.
And it doesn't look like we have any more questions. Thank you so much, Kelly and Scott, for joining us today, and wonderful presentation. And thank you, audience, for taking time out of your busy day to join us as well. We know that time is hard to come by these days, and we really just appreciate you spending it with us. We will be having 2 more of these types of educational webinars in the coming months, so be on the lookout for those. And Kelly, would you like to offer any closing remarks?
Well, I'd just like to say thank you, Adrienne, for the chance to present today. When we look at the AP Center and what it can offer and ROI, our main points are that we're eliminating paperwork and the manual routing associated with that. We're capturing discounts. We're leveraging best of terms. We're doing a better identification of duplicate invoices. We're avoiding late payment penalties, and we're improving our customer relations, which allows us to negotiate better on the pricing of those products when you have good relationships with those strategic vendors. And then in addition to that, of course, the vendor portal really provides great cost savings as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us today. For more information on our company, you can visit our website at icmdocs.com. That's icmdocs.com, and we just look forward to hearing from you. We'd love to explore with you your individual interests, either as an end user or as an ICM partner.
And I will be sending a follow-up email to everybody who attended and registered for the webinar, along with the recording. And the contact information I provide will be Scott Themont. And Scott works side by side with Kelly over at ICM. And just once again, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.